There are a couple more thoughts I'd like to pass on. Firstly, let me be clear. I believe very much in free markets, such that any comments that I make here are not about replacing free markets so much as tempering them. As I detail in my book, pure free markets can have negative consequences. We have had very open financial markets, which can amplify good as well as not so good outcomes. For example, the US has run very accommodative monetary policy over the last decade. If another country hedges their currency against the US dollar, they then import this loose monetary policy into their country. So that if one country is doing something which is unsustainable, another country can end up doing the same thing in order to remain competitive with the first country. Open financial markets can therefore produce a race to the bottom in terms of sustainable outcomes. To some degree, this is happening with currencies at the moment. But if every country is trying to move their currency lower, it is hard for any country to actually move their currency much lower on a sustainable basis, suggesting this is unlikely to be the sustainable solution we hope it might be. It has not been, and it is not my intention to tell different countries what to do with their economies. There are a multitude of ways to get to a successful solution within the framework I've laid out. There are different ways to balance budgets, for example. Each country must choose their own path. Just yesterday, I again heard the phrase, "Everybody knows what to do," to which the European politician Juncker added, "We just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it." In part, I'm trying to support the authorities to do what they know is right, what is sustainable, and to encourage young people to speak up and demand that politicians do what is economically sustainable. I also want to encourage countries and authorities to throw away some parts of economics that don't make much sense. For example, raw GDP is a poor measure of sustainable growth. As with the young person spending more than they can afford to spend and putting it on the credit card, measuring spending, i.e. raw GDP, as a measure of the health of an economy is a poor measure. You can increase GDP by borrowing more, but that doesn't mean that you should interpret higher GDP as a good thing. A lot of China's growth, for example, comes from building, which requires borrowing. Some will be good borrowing, providing infrastructure for the future. However, some will be an inefficient use of resources. It is commonly acknowledged that a lot of steel refineries aren't profit-making in China, for example. This will mean that a region is borrowing to support an industry which may provide jobs, but this may not be the most efficient way to provide those jobs. It could be providing jobs in GDP today at the cost of borrowing, which will be a drain on GDP and jobs down the track. I strongly suspect that if China borrows less for each job created, they could provide jobs at the rate which they require, which is one of its primary objectives, even while raw GDP actually decreases, because raw GDP is a poor measure of economic success. Japan is another interesting example. I believe that Japan has a lot of troubles, debt issues and demographic issues. It has been working through these issues for a long time. While it does have too much debt, one thing they've done well is to manage to keep employment high. While this may not have been the most efficient use of labour, it has provided stability in the economy that shouldn't be underrated. Other countries are trying to create jobs to increase levels of employment. I think that there are things to be learned from Japan. Yes, they have to change some things, but don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Pure free market principles are likely to see a lot more people unemployed in Japan, which will cause issues in the short run and not necessarily solve their issues in the long run. I think that most economies need to move on from their existing framework and to operate in a slightly different framework in the manner that I proposed. While a lot of people criticise Japan, and I think they have more troubles than most, I think this is primarily from not balancing budgets, and that there are other lessons that we can learn from Japan. I'd even go so far as to say we can learn from some of the Mediterranean countries. There is a satiated pace of life in these countries, which is a wonderful thing. While this pace of life could be criticised for contributing to some of the issues in these countries, I think we also need to pause and reflect on the situation that the world is in. There is a book out called The Age of Oversupply. I haven't read it, but the phrase is a common theme in my book. If we have built too much for the moment, manically trying to build more can't be the solution. It suggests we need to step back and enjoy things a little more. We've built a lot. There are a lot of beautiful things around the world. One of the biggest crimes would be to knock down a lot of things in war and have to rebuild them, with the biggest tragedy of war being the loss of life involved, which again mainly affects the young generation. A wonderful thing about the world we live in, via travel and the internet, is that everyday people better understand everyday people in other countries. There are differences, but we are a lot the same. We have dreams in common for ourselves and our kids. Most places that I've been, be it Europe, America, China, Japan, people mainly want to be friendly. They like a laugh. Typically they enjoy good food, and they often enjoy a drink and a joke. We all like to think about positive outcomes. What I'm talking about is insurance if things don't go so well. While I hope that things pick up economically, there is some chance that things stay soft or indeed get worse, in which case if leaders feel insecure, there can be incentives to negatively focus on other countries in order to unite a country. We, the children of the world, need to convince the authorities around the world that such behaviour does not endear them in our eyes. We have taken war and weapons to a point where we know that ultimately there can be no true winners, only, as they say, ashes in our mouth. I love nationalism on the sporting field, and I suspect that there will be economic battles between countries. I hope that the measures of success of such battles are not how much one country bests another by, but how sustainably successful an individual country is, either by itself or with others, such that others want to emulate it. In the same way, we have looked the ultimate outcomes of war in the eye and seen that it is not a solution. I think we are now looking at the consequences of taking free market principles and current economic thinking too far. We have an environment that is groaning under the weight of human population. We need to moderate this growth. In most countries around the world, we are struggling to provide jobs for the existing population, yet we have other people calling for increasing population as their simplistic recipes for economic success suggest that more people equals higher economic growth. These people really need to read my book and get a dose of common sense into their models. I have suggested that an obligation of modern governments is that they provide incentives for jobs, or that they support the unemployed. I would prefer incentives to support, i.e. that a government provides $10 in every 100 to support a job, rather than pay $100 of every 100 to support a person. While I prefer that governments are as small as possible, the reality is that governments and central banks can have a significant impact on economies. I suggest, for example, that low real interest rates over the last 20 years have reduced the cost of capital compared to labour, so favouring automation over jobs and wage inflation. These are influences that no individual worker can compete against, so are a failure of the current approach. While I prefer small government to the extent that it is possible, in a world where governments and central banks can have such pervasive influences, we need to be very clear to articulate what our measures of success are for governments, and to be sure that their stated objectives to us are in tune with their influence on the economy, both over the short and long term. The current economic path the global economy is on will lead us to either a good outcome or to spectacular failure. What I am proposing is that we guarantee an acceptable outcome. Not only will this not rule out the possibility of spectacularly good outcomes, the stability offered by such an approach would provide may indeed facilitate such upside. Anyway, thanks again to Ray for providing a very good video to educate people on the mechanisms and importance of credit creation. I hope that you have found my thoughts an interesting challenge and extension of that work. I call on young people around the world to get more involved in the economic process, and that we encourage all governments to drive for a sustainable economic path that is intergenerationally fair. If you found this video thought-provoking, download my book, or if you're old school, grab a paper copy. Read it over the Christmas break, and let's change the world for the better.